Okay, hello everyone. Good afternoon for those of you in Europe. Good morning if you're following us from the Western Hemisphere, and good evening if you're in Asia or the Asia Pacific. Hello and welcome to this side event of the 2022 Trade and Environment Week, which focuses on trade and climate change adaptation. My name is Alice Tipping and I lead work on trade policy at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. We're a think tank with a Canada-based head office and a large office in Geneva, from which we do a lot of work. And I'm absolutely delighted to be joined this afternoon by representatives of the co-organizers of this session, Maxine Hunter from the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat Office here in Geneva. And our thanks go to her and to Ambassador Falemaka for their excellent cooperation in helping to bring this side event together. I'd like to say just a few words, if I may, about why we've chosen to organize an event on this particular topic this week before I pass the floor to our very interesting speakers. And I confess that I'm stealing some words here already from one of our speakers, my colleague Anne Hamill, who leads our work on climate adaptation. But to steal some of her words, I think it's clear that over the course of the years, the global response to climate change has really taken place along two tracks, both mitigation, actions to prevent further warming of the global atmosphere, and adaptations, so work to prepare for or protect against the negative impacts of climate change. And there are clearly links between both of those tracks of work. The more we manage to mitigate climate change, the less we will have to adapt, to take the very simplest connection. But what I've been struck by over the years is that despite the importance of both tracks of work, adaptation has traditionally received far less attention in policy debates. And in fact, until relatively recently, it was viewed as a sort of plan B, as a surrender of sorts, to take Anne's words. And I think that's an extremely important observation, because I think that explains why we have heard much less about climate adaptation, despite its deep existential importance to many countries, and in particular to many extremely vulnerable developing countries. I think the sense of this degree of priority is changing, and as scientific consensus has coalesced around the realities of climate change, the realities of the warming of the global atmosphere, it's clear that both mitigation and adaptation are going to have to be pursued very much together. Notwithstanding that realization, the discussion about adaptation and its links to economic policy is still relatively nascent. There have been some reports out there, including one by the WTO Secretariat, but in our view, this is a discussion that deserves to be deepened. In particular, and alongside a discussion of how climate adaptation takes place in practice. So in a sense, this session is designed to bring two worlds of policy together, climate adaptation work and trade policy work, so that we can look a little bit at what we can learn from countries' national adaptation planning processes, their adaptation needs, and to think a little bit more about the relevance of trade policy in pursuing these objectives. And this is of particular interest to us at IISD, because within our organization, we have not only a team of trade policy experts who I lead, but because IISD also acts as the Secretariat for the National Adaptation Planning, or NAP, Global Network. So we have a whole team of experts who are dedicated to supporting countries increase their resilience to climate change. So it's something that's important for us as an institution. So welcome, thank you for coming to join us in this discussion. Thank you for those in the room and the many of you who we have joining online. And just a reminder for those online, we will be keeping the Q&A box open. So if you'd like to provide questions in the discussion, please put the box in there, and my colleague Andreas will be monitoring it and letting me know what questions we can include in the discussion. So please don't feel that even though you're not here at the WTO, you're not part of the discussion. You absolutely are. So to introduce the panel of experts, I'm really delighted to introduce all four of them. We have two very important introductory speakers. We have Ambassador Nela Pepe Tavita-Levi, who is the permanent representative of Samoa to the World Trade Organization. And in fact, I believe you're Samoa's first resident ambassador in Geneva, so a double welcome. And she'll lead off with some introductory remarks about her own particular perspective and Samoa's perspective about climate change adaptation, and perhaps its relevance in general to the Pacific region, and any links to trade policy she'd like to identify. We're then going to need to hear from my colleague Anne Hamels, who is IISD's Senior Director, and she leads IISD's Resilience Program. And we've asked Anne to tell us, from an adaptation expert's perspective, what the national adaptation planning process looks like, and some links she can see into trade policy. And after those two important first sets of remarks, we're going to have the benefit of two additional perspectives from different regions. We'll hear first from Joel Richards, who is a senior technical specialist and a very experienced trade negotiator at the Geneva mission of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. And again, we've asked him a similar question to just tell us about the links that he sees between the adaptation concept and work on trade policy and from the Caribbean perspective. And then last but not least, we'll be joined by video by Dr. Famida Khatun, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Policy Dialogue in Bangladesh. And similarly, we've asked her for her specific perspectives, particularly on the least developed country perspective on these questions, right? How does this intersection between adaptation and trade policy look different when you're a least developed country? And so she's provided an extremely useful and very detailed presentation of some of these links. So after those four different perspectives, we'll have some time for questions and answers before I close promptly at 2:45 to allow everyone in the room to get to their 3 o'clock meetings. So that's more than enough from me. I'm delighted to hand the floor first to you, Ambassador Talofa Lava. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Alice. Good morning, distinguished fellow panelists, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, friends. I thank the International Institute for Sustainable Development for this platform to exchange and dialogue on this important issue of climate change and adaptation and its link to trade and trade policy. And I must say, Alice, that this discussion, that I agree with you, that this discussion needs to be deepened. At the outset, I'll say my background is trade. And in the process of preparing for this presentation, this panelist, I've come to realize and agree with you that there is not much out there to link the two tracks of work. And I think events such as this will help us begin that discussion or deepen that discussion, if not done so already. And I recognize the WTO work that has been done on this nexus of climate change adaptation and trade policy. I also acknowledge the Pacific Islands Forum, Maxine and Ambassador Falemaka, and their role in organizing the Pacific here in Geneva to ensure that our voices are elevated and strengthened, especially on issues relating to climate change. As you would be aware, Pacific leaders have endorsed climate change as one of the Pacific priorities, and in fact declared in July this year that the Pacific is facing a climate emergency, with climate change being the single greatest existential threat facing the Blue Pacific continent. Following the guideline of our session this morning that the impacts of climate change vary in different parts of the world, perhaps I can zoom in on the Pacific part of the world and say that the Pacific Islands are large oceanic states. We are the custodians of nearly 20% of the Earth's surface. 13 of the 38 UN small island developing states are in the Pacific. And just as I was preparing to come in this morning, I had to go back and find out where did SIDS come from? And in 1993, the UN General Assembly recognized the special case of SIDS, both in regards to the environment and development, and that SIDS are ecologically fragile and vulnerable, that SIDS' small size, limited resources, geographic dispersion and isolation from marketplace places SIDS at a disadvantage economically and limits the economies of scale. and that for SIDS, the ocean and coastal environment is of strategic importance and constitutes a valuable development resource. Ladies and gentlemen, just by reading that, that's the definition of the Pacific. Small island developing states scattered over a huge landmass of ocean, and the impacts of climate change in the Pacific region, particularly on the SIDS, have been documented widely. Exacerbated by climate change, we are highly susceptible to external shocks, severe and more frequent natural disasters, resulting in a vicious cycle of rebuilding and delayed rebuilding efforts and recovery. The Pacific region faces high average temperatures, which I understand, and you will cover the climate change adaptation side of things, high sea level rise, increase in ocean acidification, marine and biodiversity loss. The 2021 World Risk Report identified the Oceania continent with the highest disaster risk, mainly due to high exposure to extreme natural events. In fact, the top 3 highest disaster risk countries are Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, and Tonga from the Pacific. Despite being the low contributors or emitters to the global climate crisis, adaptation in the Pacific remains perhaps the most feasible and increasingly necessary means of addressing climate change impacts. And I think most importantly is recognizing that adaptation has to become an integral part of our sustainable development efforts in the face of climate change crisis. For the Pacific, and we've come to realize, and Alice, as we spoke this morning, there's a lot of conceptual frameworks that exist. And I think a positive outcome of our exchange this morning is to look at some of the tangible work that has been done at the regional and national level and globally, to see how small and developing states can adapt and use trade policy to support their development efforts. In the Pacific, the framework or architecture in which the Pacific responds to the impacts of climate change includes the Framework for Resilient Development in the Pacific. It's an integrated regional approach to address climate change, disaster risk management, low carbon approach, and climate financing. And I understand that the Pacific is one of the first to develop such a framework. Secondly, there's also the Pacific Resilience Partnership, which I understand aims at implementing that resilient development of Pacific and framework. And I understand that a Pacific Resilience Facility has also been established as a Pacific-led and Pacific-owned initiative to ensure local communities are empowered to build their own resilience through the implementation of locally led adaptation measures. And finally, and more recently, our Pacific leaders adopted the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent with climate change and disaster as one of the 7 thematic areas, highlighting the importance of climate change action and protection of the ocean's health and integrity. And hence, I think this is why the Pacific interest in the WTO to ensure that the WTO Fisheries Subsidies Agreement would be an agreement that would discipline certain forms of fisheries subsidies which contribute to overcapacity and overfishing, as well as to IUU fishing. The slow and onset impacts of sea level rise threatens the security of the region's maritime zones. In 2021, the Pacific leaders have agreed to a declaration on preserving maritime zones in the face of climate change related sea level rise. And it's a regional collective position and commitment to maintaining maritime zones without reduction in the face of climate change related sea level rise. On the trade side at the regional level, we have the 4 thematic priority areas of the Pacific Aid for Trade strategy, which are services, electronic commerce, comprehensive connectivity, and deepening foreign markets. In essence, these key thematic areas, they correspond to a shift focus to develop service and digital trade, rather than the traditional focus on commodity or goods and agriculture. And if just going through the Pacific Aid for Trade strategy, while it may not be implicitly stated there, but just looking back at those 4 areas is in fact a response to the impacts of our efforts on service trade and digital service development. Labor mobility in the region through temporary and seasonal employment opportunity holds much potential, but I also caution that there needs to be further consideration of labor mobility opportunities to make it as part of our integral policy development. So the RSE scheme of New Zealand and the labor mobility scheme of Australia, Pacific Island countries as labor sending countries benefits from these opportunities. So from the Pacific, for Samoa, pardon me, the Blue Pacific region's priorities reflect Samoa's priorities as well. Climate change resilience, sustainable ocean management, use and conservation, regional security, fisheries, nuclear legacy issues, and regional and national responses to COVID-19 and recovery efforts. So we are in line, our national priorities are in line with our regional approach. And I think it's very important that as small countries here in Geneva, that we work together as a collective, and especially as ocean states in the Pacific. I think coming together to make our voices heard is very important. As SIDS, Samoa shares with all other SIDS the characteristics, as I earlier referred to, of being economically vulnerable and ecologically fragile because of geographical location, isolation, limited resources, and exposure to global economic crisis. Climate change impacts are an added imposition on the inherent challenge that Samoa already faces as a SIDS to achieve its sustainable development goals. I have a very long presentation, but I'm cautious of the time, but just to say that with a small economic base, a small EEZ, and all these things, in our efforts to respond to all these challenges, we have in place, we have our pathway for development, and a secured environment and climate change is a key strategic outcome of that 5-year pathway plan for Samoa. And that plan recognizes the real challenge is not about securing more scientific evidence, setting new global targets, and taking or making new pledges. Rather, for us, it's about survival. And actions that we would like to see should include investment in sustainable and renewable energy sources, support community and replanting efforts to build climate resilience from flooding, for example, while at the same time offering economic opportunities for landowners, improving climate resilience and disaster risk management across all sectors of the economy, and drawing on the extensive risk mapping that has been done for Samoa. We have a Samoa National Climate Change Policy, 2020 to 2030, which is a framework that provides both national adaptation and mitigation actions on a whole of country approach to build resilience to the impacts of climate change. And I think with that, I could stop there, and there's an opportunity to speak further. Thank you very much.
You know, there will be, and Manuia Fa'apete, Ambassador. That was an extremely useful, I think, sort of first take on the question. And I think you've illustrated very well for us, not only the deep and immediate vulnerabilities of many SIDS, in particular Pacific Island countries, but also you've illustrated for us, I think, what your beginning point was, which is that there are a lot of frameworks out there. You talked about the adaptation frameworks already existing in the Pacific. You talked about the Pacific's Aid for Trade strategy and its focus on services and digital trade, and the focus on the ocean economy. And the sense I get from you is that we have a lot of frameworks and we have a lot of senses of how these things should be connected. And what we really need to do next is to deepen this discussion into points on specific policy issues, specific challenges, and more detailed, perhaps more detailed thinking about how trade policy can contribute to some of these particular issues. So maybe that's what our next workshop will deal with. But that was an extremely useful introduction, Ambassador, so thank you. I'm going to turn now next to you, Anne. You know the adaptation process better than anyone else in the world, probably. Can you tell us a little bit about kind of how that process looks and some of the links to trade policy that we've already explored as ISD?
Sure, and thanks so much for this invitation and this opportunity to engage with a community for various reasons that the adaptation team does not get to engage with. So this is really exciting. So what I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about is not necessarily adaptation. I think the ambassador has really sort of mapped out, and you yourself in your opening remarks have really talked about what adaptation is and why it's so important. I'm going to sort of talk about this nexus of trade and adaptation and sort of broadening it from where we've traditionally seen this conversation, and some openings for really leveraging trade and addressing the adaptation priorities of countries around the world, particularly those most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Let's see if this one, can you advance? Great. Just to sort of by way of a bit of context here on adaptation. Yes, it is about preparing for and protecting against the negative impacts of climate change. But I think what I wanted to sort of convey in this slide is that adaptation is much more than sort of technocratic, structural types of measures. The world of adaptation involves not just the engineered solutions and the application of technologies, using and working with our ecosystems to buffer the impacts, for example, delivering specific services, but there's also a whole suite of social measures involved in adaptation. And so this is whether it's from education, information, behavioral measures, and also very importantly in all of this, and I think this touches again on part of the conversation we're having here this afternoon, are a number of institutional and governance measures that are really critical to helping countries adapt to the impacts of climate change. And so we're talking about sort of the economic measures, whether it's through taxes, subsidies, insurance, the laws and regulations around zoning or building codes, for example, property rights, and then of course, government policies and programs. And so what I just wanted to convey here again is that the world of adaptation and the measures that countries and communities can take to adapt to the impacts of climate change is quite broad. And so we should have this in mind when we're talking about adaptation to climate change. The other thing I want to convey is that there is a huge and widening adaptation gap. We're simply just not keeping up. The pace of adaptation is not keeping up with the pace of changes that we're observing and expecting. Adaptation is much more widespread than it has been before. We've got more programs and projects and money going towards it than before. But these efforts are largely fragmented, relatively small in scale, pilot in scale. They're incremental rather than transformative, if you will. They can be sector specific. And then critically, they often respond to near-term or immediate climate risks and not really thinking about what's coming down the line in 10, 20, 30 years. And so we need to be really redoubling our efforts and investing a lot more in adaptation to really keep pace with the changes that we're already experiencing and expecting to experience. And on this, it's worth mentioning that, we have identified that there are hard and soft limits to adaptation. The hard limits, what we're talking about here, are just when certain thresholds are met, that no additional action is possible, that this is a change that's just happened. And no matter how many adjustments we make, we're not going to be able to necessarily, live in a particular environment, for example, continue a particular economic activity. But more than that, though, we have a lot of soft limits to adaptation. And so that means that the options aren't currently available, but they might be available in the future. And this slide captures the different types of limits, the soft limits to adaptation, from financial and human capacity to governance institutional. And I won't go into a lot of detail here, but this is, I think it's really important to flag these soft limits because it shows you that a lot still can be done. And this is where we need to look at things like trade policy. to help us address these limits to adaptation and really unlock the potential that a lot of communities and countries have to adjust to the impacts of climate change. Now, typically, the nexus between climate change adaptation and trade has really focused, I think, traditionally on looking at how climate change is going to impact the trading system, the trading capacity of different countries, and how do you protect and make adjustments to that sector, to those sorts of institutions that are involved in it. But I think the nexus is much, much broader than that. And in a way, it's almost looking at the flip side. And it's looking at the fact that, you know, the countries are identifying their near, medium, and long-term priorities when it comes to adapting to the impacts of climate change, whether it's in the health sector, whether it's in agriculture, of course, tourism, all sorts of, all parts of society. They've identified, you know, what kinds of actions need to be taken to anticipate and prepare for the impacts of climate change. And trade has a huge role in helping countries address these priorities and adaptation. So it's not just about protecting the trading system and the trading capacities of a country, but it's also using trade to address a whole suite of priorities that are going to be really important to help them adapt to the impacts of climate change. And so this report that we released last year was starting to sort of look at that in a bit of detail and identify some entry points for how trade could support climate change adaptation more broadly. And we identified 3 general pathways. We identified domestic trade policy measures that enhance access to adaptation goods and services. And I'll get into what we mean by adaptation goods and services in a moment. Looking at accessing to trade-related financing mechanisms that support climate adaptation, and then trade agreements, so international collaborative frameworks on trade and support of climate adaptation. So just looking at the first one quickly, let me just go to the next slide here. And so here we're really looking at trade policy measures that can be designed to facilitate the availability and accessibility of particular goods and services that are required to adapt to climate change. So if you look at, for example, a country's national adaptation plan, which lays out the different adaptation priorities in different sectors or systems in a given country, you get a sense of the types of goods and services that might be needed. And so looking at the different you know, trade policy instruments that will remove barriers to trade in these goods and services. It's worth noting, though, that adaptation to the impacts of climate change, and therefore the goods and services that are implicated in all that, it's highly context specific. And priorities might change, adaptation priorities might change over time with shifting climate conditions. So really trying to develop a comprehensive and static checklist of goods and services won't work. And in fact, it could actually lead to maladaptation. So you need to be flexible in monitoring situations and open, but I think it's still a useful framework to think about adaptation goods and services. And just some illustrative examples to think about, and you know, I won't spend a lot of time in this, but in terms of adaptation goods, we can think about goods that are produced in a manner that explicitly manage climate risks. And so you've got, for example, flood resistant maize. So using specially bred species that are flood resistant, but also using techniques like cover crops and no-till farming to manage water in increasingly flooded areas. Or clothing produced with special fibers that can consume less water, food and beverages processed using recycled water to deal with the fact that you know, an area is dealing with more constricted water availability. Adaptation goods can also be goods that are used to reduce the impacts of climate change. So it's not just about how they're produced, but how they're consumed. And so here we're looking at things like climate resilient seeds or water efficient irrigation. Desalination is becoming an increasingly important technology that's needed in coastal areas exposed to sea level rise. And of course, early warning systems, critical to dealing with impacts of climate change, especially the most acute ones, and dealing with it in the context of more extreme events. Next slide, please. Adaptation services are really the range of activities necessary to support the production and use of these goods. And so here, unsurprising, these are very familiar, I think, to most of us. It could be qualified labor for collecting and analyzing climate data. It might be engineering services to design and build climate resilient infrastructure. It's research and development. It's doing regular risk assessments, agricultural extension services in climate smart agriculture. So this is just kind of captures the range of services. Next slide. The second pathway for how trade might be leveraged to support adaptation is really looking at the access to trade-related financing mechanisms. And here we know it's worth noting that the adaptation finance gap is huge. There's an estimate that we're going to need between $300 and $500 billion dollars annually to meet the adaptation needs in developing countries. Right now, we've got about 30 billion that's going to adaptation. So a huge gap. 5% of global climate financing is going to adaptation. And so a couple of entry points for accessing the financing that's needed for adaptation is looking at aid for trade. So you can maybe look at using aid for trade as co-financing for accessing other climate change funds through the Green Climate Fund, for example, the Adaptation Fund, or also integrating adaptation into trade-related ODA. To ensure that trade is actually supporting adaptation. And then the other pathway that we flagged was the enhanced integrated framework, for example, integrating adaptation considerations into tools like the diagnostic trade integration studies. And then the third pathway, and I'll end with this, is looking at international collaborative frameworks on trade to support climate adaptation. And so looking at trade agreements themselves as entry points to identify and advance mutual areas of interest through targeted cooperation. And so we've got some possible avenues that we've listed in the paper and where we might sort of further explore where this intersection exists. And just to sort of maybe end my presentation, I note that, there are a lot of resources and frameworks and conversations happening in countries about adaptation and adaptation priorities and needs. And national adaptation plans and the national adaptation planning process is one of them. And so we've got 129 developing countries that are already undertaking national adaptation planning. And so when we're really trying to understand what this nexus looks like, I'd highly encourage folks that are sort of in the trade world to reach out to those parts of government that are working on advancing these national adaptation planning processes to understand where these priorities are, where the gaps and the needs are, and then really understand how the two worlds can come together to address them together. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
And thank you very much. That was an extremely useful next presentation, because in fact, I think it helped us to deepen the discussion, as I was saying, just a little step further. And I was struck by a couple of things you said at the very beginning. One of the key limitations of a lot of adaptation work is that it focuses on the very immediate vulnerabilities, right, rather than looking sort of over the horizon at what might be coming next. But it also, your list of sort of soft limits and the identification of perhaps trade policy is one of these soft limits, right, where your trade policy structures, which in many ways define how your economy relates to the rest of the world, aren't suited and don't quite match what you need to adapt. I thought that was a really interesting idea. And your examples of what adaptation goods and adaptation services could be, not perhaps necessarily to have a whole static list, but to give countries food for thought, to think about what it is you might need, and do you have these things to adapt? I thought that was all really useful contributions. So thank you very much. I did see people in the room taking pictures of the slides. Don't worry if you missed them. We're happy to circulate them, I'm sure. And for those of you online, I see about 70 of you. So we've got a solid 100 people here. Please, if you have questions, I'm delighted to take them. Please put them in the Q&A box. You can do it right now. You don't have to wait and write them down. You can put them in the Q&A box now, and I'm happy to feed them into the discussion at the end. So thank you again, Anne. That was super helpful. We're going to turn next from the Pacific to the Caribbean. Joel, thank you for joining us. We'd be interested to hear how all of these ideas sound from the Caribbean perspective, and also specifically from somebody who understands Caribbean trade policy very well. What would you like to say?
Thank you very much, Alice, and good afternoon to everyone in the room, excellencies, colleagues, many thanks to the organizers, IISD and the PIFS, Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, for organizing this and for the invitation as well. I want to respond, of course, looking at the Caribbean context, as you rightfully said. And I want to sort of contextualize where we are now with respect to climate change impacts in the region. But I also want to speak to some of the trade policy responses that some of our governments are initiating. And then I want to, because we're at the WTO, this is CTE week, and I want to talk about some of the responses that could also come from this body here that we are all part of. So first of all, just to indicate that, as Alice said, I'm from the OECS, the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. We are a small regional economic grouping in the Eastern Caribbean, comprising of 6 WTO members, which are Antigua and Barbuda, Dominica, Grenada, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And of course, we are part of a broader Caribbean community, which is CARICOM as well, which comprises about 13 members, which are part of the WTO. Now, climate change is certainly a phenomenon which is already impacting on our region. So it's not a theoretical debate. In the past, since the 1980s, of all of the Category 5 hurricanes, for example, which have impacted our region, 3/4 of them have taken place since the turn of the new century. So that is an indication that these weather events, which are being driven by a warming climate, are actually having a debilitating and increasingly so impact on the part of the world where I am from. Now, one of the areas in which climate change is having a significant impact on our region is with respect to how it is impacting on our economic fundamentals. And here I am talking about our trade infrastructure. I am talking about our GDP to debt and how it is impacting on that. For example, with respect to debt, there are some countries that have indicated that in the past decade, as much as 15% of debt incurred has been incurred as a result of monies that have been borrowed for climate change adaptation. And that is very significant for small economies with very narrow fiscal spaces already. So that's certainly a problem. The other problem, and how it impacts on trade as well, is that climate change impacts. So when there's flooding, when there are these extreme weather events, they certainly impact on all of our economic sectors, because already we have very narrow production structures. And so when you have a single hurricane, it means that production can literally grind to a halt in the parts of the world where we are from. We've had instances where, for instance, because our countries are small, you're not going to find more than 2 ports of entry in most of our jurisdictions. And the smallness of our landmass means that one weather event affects the entire country. So it's not like the United States or Australia, where it might be limited to a particular state. It is impacting the entire country. And so what you find is that an entire economy, could be shut down. You can have a power blackout, which impacts an entire island. That means you cannot produce. And then if your ports are locked out, it means that goods are not going out and they're not coming in. And that includes vital response from the international community by way of humanitarian response as well. And of course, services is severely impacted as well, because then our economies are heavily reliant on tourism, and those types of developments also limit the extent to which tourism can also thrive and operate. Now, I want to talk very quickly about some of the measures that our region is currently undertaking from both a trade and economic standpoint, and just to indicate that in all of our government policies and actions, and even what we are doing internationally, climate change is actually a fundamental part of our policy, of our foreign policy, of our economic policy. It is very central to all of those. And so in terms of responses, what we are seeing is that some governments are already introducing and spoke to some of those soft responses that could be undertaken. So what we're seeing is that governments are actively exploring renewable and alternative forms of energy, such as looking at investments in geothermal, in wind, and in solar. These are very expensive to undertake. For instance, there's one country that did some geothermal exploration a few years ago, would have received some funding from the World Bank and from the Caribbean Development Bank and some others. And it costs, I think, over $100 to $200 million just for the exploration alone. Okay, so that's not something that a small economy can sustain. What was unfortunate was that after having done the exploration, the results suggested that there wasn't sufficient geothermal activity to sustain energy production and generation. So even when we are exploring, you also need financing to be able to do that because of the risk involved. We are also establishing a number of loss and damage priorities. We see loss and damage as one of those areas in which we need to have some focused attention. And in this regard, several countries are introducing debt instruments with a disaster link clause, allowing, for example, for an automatic extension of debt service in the event of a disaster. So we're looking at a fairly umbrella approach with respect to how we integrate climate change and natural disaster impacts into our debt instruments. Some countries are also looking at climate change and disaster risk management insurance for vulnerable businesses. And of course, as our private sector certainly is impacted. And a number of countries are also looking at the expansion of risk insurance markets, including by seeking out risk insurance for critical infrastructure projects. Again, I spoke about how these events tend to impact on our infrastructure. So that particular one is very important. Now, other trade policy responses that we are seeing, and there are two countries in two very recent budget cycles have indicated that they will be reducing tariffs or eliminating tariffs entirely on electric and hybrid vehicles. We see this as critical by encouraging consumers to change their behaviors and their practices. And we see tariffs as one policy tool to be able to do that. We've seen governments banning the importation and use of styrofoam and single-use plastics. And of course, this is to help to preserve our environmental space. We're seeing tax holidays for companies that are importing wind and solar equipment. Again, it's important to incentivize the private sector to be a co-creator with the public sector in terms of how we engage in response. Now, as it relates to the WTO and some of what we need to do in our discussions here, in the ongoing discussions on reform, for example, and especially from a developmental point of view, it perhaps might be instructive to give credibility to the concept of some sort of index as a tool for how we can quantify the vulnerability of certain countries, such as small island developing states. Now, a vulnerability index measures exposure to particular hazards. It is a composite of multiple quantitative indicators that, based on some formula, delivers a single numerical result that shows how countries compare to one another against vulnerability criteria. Now, the Commonwealth Secretariat, for example, has done work since the 1980s on a universal vulnerability index. In 2019, the Caribbean Development Bank updated and revised its index and published a multi-dimensional vulnerability index for the Caribbean, which sought to quantify and deepen the understanding of the relative vulnerability of Caribbean countries and ultimately help to build their resilience. And it might be useful to operationalize a vulnerability index for WTO SIDS, particularly with respect to their susceptibility to natural disasters and climate change. In the Fisheries Subsidies Agreement that we just concluded, there is a clause that speaks to beneficial subsidies for rebuilding of stock and the industry post-natural disaster. this is a good start, and perhaps we need to institutionalize these kinds of approaches in future WTO agreements, but specific to climate change, not just for natural or for man-made hazards. Also, and I'm wrapping up very soon, if I may refer you to Article 66.2 of the TRIPS Agreement, Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights. Now, we are an organization that I don't think we respond very well to ideas of waivers, especially when it comes to intellectual property. But one of the things that we need as developing countries is that we need access to technology. And Anne spoke about the massive amounts of financing that's required, a financing gap, but there is a knowledge gap, there's a know-how gap, and there's a technology gap that we also have to navigate. And in order to navigate that gap, we believe that we may have to look at how we can expand Article 6, which are built in. Of course, these are voluntary with respect to the transfer of technology from developed countries to least developed countries. It might be beneficial to see how we can extend that to small island developing states. Now, we also need to do some other things in addition to that, because what's been happening is that the evidence that these kinds of transfers are taking place is not present. So we have to look at things such as transparency and notifications, including through members' trade policy reviews, to see whether or not they are reporting on doing these things, and of course certainly see how we can integrate SIDS, as I indicated before, into the mix. Now, and I'm wrapping up. The final thing I would want to say is that there's also a working group on trade and transfer of technology, which I believe has not been very well utilized in the last few years in the WTO. It sort of seemingly has been deprioritized. I think it's also a useful forum for us to advance the conversation in terms of how small island developing states can be able to access technology through WTO from other developed WTO members, and how we can ensure that we are not creating barriers for them. For instance, we see that carbon emission reduction technologies are emerging. Those developments are not happening in our part of the world, but we need the technology as well, because we are on the front line of this climate change crisis. So I'll leave it there for now, and thank you very much. Look forward to the discussion and the comments.
Joel, thank you very much indeed. That in fact was the perfect segue again to Anne's presentation, because it took us just another little step forward in deepening the discussion and focusing on some very specific trade policy questions. And I thought the examples that you gave of some of the trade policy measures already being taken by Caribbean members was extremely useful. I was interested to hear in particular the fact that 15% of maybe additional debt or current debt resulted from expenses linked to adaptation, which is an extremely useful number because it gives us the sense of the scale, right, of the financing, in this case, the debt financing problem that many countries are facing. I thought the point about the reduction of tariffs on electronic vehicles and promotion again of wind and solar equipment was interesting, because I usually think of those things as mitigation actions. But in fact, and here's the thing I need to check with you, is the assumption there that these are useful both for mitigation and for adaptation, because it reduces the island's need to import fossil fuels, correct?
Yeah.
Nods, yeah. Okay. I had never thought about them that way, I confess. So thank you. That's a really, really useful point. And thank you also for the idea of the vulnerability index for SIDS. I'm going to come back to that question in the discussion because I'd like to know how you want to use that index, which would be really interesting. The natural disaster exceptions, again, I had not read the importance of the fisheries subsidies agreement like that. So thank you. I thought I knew that agreement better than almost anyone else. But in fact, I hadn't read that as a broader example of what we could do in agreements. So that was super. Article 66.2 of TRIPS and the trade policy reviews and the working group on trade and the transfer of technology. I took as kind of different aspects of the same technology transfer and technology building question, which I think is a fascinating set of ideas that we can discuss to move that forward. So I have notes scribbled all over my page. That was really, really useful. Thank you very much. And I'm going to turn next to Dr. Khatun. Thank you, Dr. Khatun, if you're still with us. Thank you for being so patient, and thank you for joining us. It's probably a bit late in your day, but we would be really interested to hear your perspective on this question. And I know that your presentation focuses very much on least developed countries, which is a crucial perspective to have in this discussion. So Dr. Khatun, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I would like to thank IISD and also the World Trade Organization for organizing this important session and for inviting me to this session. It has been very fascinating to listen to the previous speakers, and everyone has discussed so elaborately and eloquently on the issue. So my presentation would be to focus on some of the climate change related challenges which are faced by the least developed countries and how they are dealing with it from the perspective of trade policy measures, and
Dr.
also
Khatun,
how
I apologize for interrupting. Could I ask you if it's possible to put your slides into presentation mode so we can see them a bit bigger,
oh,
please?
I see. Okay, just
Is
a
that
second.
possible?
Yeah. Yes, sure. Thank you for letting me know. Let me try it. Sorry,
You can
not
probably,
being
might be able to
very
go to play
technical
from beginning.
from the beginning. Okay.
If it's too difficult, don't worry, you can keep going. And I will encourage everyone who can't see to move a little bit further forward. We can also circulate your slides afterwards.
Yeah, I have sent it, but yeah, okay, sure, you can do that. Let me
We'll
just
circulate them
proceed
later. Thank
because
you.
in
Go
the
ahead.
interest of time, I think we should move ahead. Okay, so I would deal with basically three issues. This is a session I recognize that this is about trade and climate change adaptation, basically. But while presenting that, I would also focus on some of the issues which are related to climate change mitigation, because in some cases those are interconnected. So, as has been discussed, that many countries are vulnerable to the impact of the climate change, and particularly the least developed countries are vulnerable to the impact of climate change. And as a result of that, there are a lot of impact on the poor, particularly the poor households and the poor people who are engaged in many economic activities which are very important for their livelihood activities. Extreme and unpredictable and also changing weather events have been taking place very frequently in the LDCs, and also the LDCs have been undertaking many activities with regard to dealing with the shocks of the climate change. However, international support measures in various forms are required, which we heard about these issues from the previous speakers. So if we look at the issues that what are the key climate change related measures which are the least developed countries and developing countries are undertaking. From the point of adaptation, LDCs have identified 9 priority sectors for adaptations, which are agriculture, food security, natural resource management, including hydrology and forest, policy strategy, disaster risk management, health, infrastructure, and energy, and also some other priority sectors. So these we have collected from the various national action plans of the LDCs. So those have indicated that how the LDCs have taken measures in these areas. And in fact, as you know, that national adaptation plan process, which was established under the Cancun Adaptation Framework at COP16 in 2011. And this enables the parties to formulate and implement national adaptation plans as a means for identifying medium to long-term adaptation needs, and also developing and implementing strategies which are very important for these countries. And also, so far, 15 LDCs have submitted their national adaptation plans to the UNFCCC. And in addition to national adaptation plans, there are also National Adaptation Program of Actions, which is called NAPA, in the LDC's work program, which was established in COP7 in 2001, which was much before the adaptation of NAP. So that is to support LDCs in addressing the challenges of climate change, given their vulnerability. So during the period of between 2006 and 2013, all LDCs had submitted their NAPA to the UNFCCC at various points in time. So a little bit of looking at the issues which also on the mitigation aspect, because when you talk about climate change, it is emission is an important aspect. And if you look at the distribution of carbon emissions across various types of countries or group of countries, we see that the per capita emission across various regions, when you compare LDC's share, is very, very little. For example, in 2019, per capita carbon emission in LDCs were only 0.35 metric tons compared to the highest of 9.82 in the high income countries. So that also shows that how little they emit, but they are they are the victims of the impact of climate change. Now, but even though their emission level is very little, many LDCs have undertaken many mitigation measures also. And in their NDCs in 2021, prior to the COP26, they have also updated that with the target to reduce 86% of the total emissions from the 2015 target of 42%. And in fact, they have undertaken both conditional and unconditional commitments, in the sense that without support from the international community, they would voluntarily reduce emissions. With support from the international community, they will improve their commitments. That is, they will increase their commitments to reduce carbon emissions. And in case of reduction in GHG, for example, the sectors, major sectors include energy, transport, waste, agriculture, and buildings. So the second issue which I would like to focus on very briefly is that how their trade policies are also related to the climate change issue, and how they are in the receiving end of the impact of climate change through trade, in fact. Because if you look at the types of products in their export and import basket, that you would find that their export items are only concentrated on a few products. For example, it's mostly petroleum oil, and also ready-made garments and textiles, and also some, gold and other manufactured products. And in case of imports, also manufactured goods, food items, chemical products, these are the major import items. So why this is important to show here, that I wanted to show that how through trade also they are the net importers of carbon emissions. All the LDCs, except I see that here, except for Laos, all the countries, LDCs are net importers of carbon emissions. So trade plays a very important negative role in terms of having the impact of climate change on these countries. Now, if you look at the the WTO in the international context, that how trade measures have been playing important role in addressing the climate change issues. One issue is that in the WTO, we see that there are various notifications by agreements and sectors. There we see the participation of LDCs is very small. For example, compared to the other countries, 64% of the notifications come from the developed countries, 32% come from the developing countries, and only 2% come from the LDCs. And these agreements, if we look at the by agreements, where these notifications are concentrated, focus, subsidies, including agriculture subsidy, and then technical barriers to trade. And by sectors, obviously, it's manufacture and energy, and then agriculture, forestry, and fisheries. So in the interest of time, maybe I'll just skip some of the slides, but I would also look at some of the trade measures which are useful and which are applicable for which are very contextualized in the context of the LDCs. In fact, the economic incentives, when you talk about the economic incentives, which play a major role in case of dealing with the climate change, its aspects, I mean, either it depends on the use, how you use the instrument, so it can increase the emission or it can reduce also. So economic incentives, one of the important economic incentives is the subsidy. So fossil fuel subsidy reforms have a very important role, because it is one of the important sources of resource exhaustion, because subsidies always encourages the use of resources, natural resources. As a result, it degrades the environment, and which has a negative impact on climate change. So in case of the LDCs, we have seen, of course, given their economic conditions, LDCs have been providing subsidies. In fact, in some cases it is needed. For example, agriculture is an area where many LDCs provide subsidies from the point of food security, which is very important as well. In many LDCs also, there have been subsidies on fuel as well, but over the time it is reducing. So we can see there is gradually it is increasing. One of the reasons is that these LDCs are also dependent on the support of the multilateral organizations and also bilaterals as well. And when they take support from these organizations, one of the conditionalities is that to reduce the subsidies. So that is one of the important reasons. The other area of trade measures is the border measures, which is to discourage trade in carbon-intensive goods and encouraging trade in climate-supportive goods and services. So, which is very good. I mean, measures like carbon adjustment or the equalization measures, which is the CBAM, has been widely discussed, which is going to be imposed. But it is also apprehended to affect the trade from the developing countries and graduating LDCs, because these countries are not yet prepared to take measures in terms of improving in terms of manufacturing less carbon intensive goods and services. So this is one of the important areas where the LDCs would require support. I will discuss that later on when towards the end of my presentation. So the other issue which I wanted to focus on is that how these issues are being dealt in the context of the WTO conversations. So there are many measures, but 3 areas where I would like to focus on is that LDCs require support. My previous speakers have also focused on these issues, that I would like to mainly emphasize 3 areas. One is finance, then second is technology, and then third is the capacity building. In all these areas, LDCs require support to be an environmentally friendly country, and also to produce goods which will emit less carbon. and also which will help them to adapt to the impact of climate change, because as has been also mentioned earlier, that there is a need for a lot of financial support. And when you see the composition of the climate fund, then the share of adaptation fund is much less compared to the mitigation, whereas the LDCs need most of their support in the form of adaptation funds. So this is very important. And also some of the LDCs are in the process of graduating. There are many in the pipeline, but in 2026, 3 LDCs, including my own country, Bangladesh, then Nepal, Laos, PTR, they are set to graduate. Once LDCs graduate, they will be deprived of many international support measures, because one of the important ones is the withdrawal of the duty-free, quota-free market access, but finance is also going to be an important one. Their access to finance at a concessional rate will be withdrawn. So, and also access to grants and other kinds of supports which are provided through various windows, those will be also reduced. So it is all the more important that these countries are provided with new ISMs for environmental friendly and sustainable trade in LDCs. So those are needed. And then the increased share of aid for trade related capacity building, and particularly in the LDCs, small and medium enterprises, which have very limited access to finance, those will be requiring a lot of finance. And also within the SMEs, women-led businesses will also need finance in order to be environmentally compliant. So the share was needed. And then in case of the EU's CBAM, I have mentioned earlier that this is a worry of the graduating LDCs, and they should be provided extended time to comply with such measures. The other support measure is in the areas of technical assistance and capacity building, so that they can adopt low carbon production methods, and also they can meet the environmental standards in the export market. So this is just to show how the climate fund is distributed in the LDCs. Of course, they need more support for the adaptation, and it is given. It is higher compared to the mitigation, but so if you look at the global, global share, it's very little. That has been mentioned earlier. Now, this is my final slide. I want to show that in the context of the WTO, there are many forums where these issues can be expedited, these issues can be discussed, and some of the negotiations can be concluded. So the Committee on Trade and Environment, there are issues which are directly relating to climate change, such as the environmental benefits of removing trade restrictions in energy, forest and forestry sectors, and also the effect of energy efficiency labeling on market access. These are being discussed. Then trade and environmental sustainability structured discussions that has been established in 2020, and which is also expected to complement the work of the CTE and other relevant WTO bodies. The Committee on Technical Barriers to Trade, that is also discussing issues on technical regulations which are adopted by governments to mitigate climate change. The agreement on TRIPS, basically, it has been discussed in the context of the technology transfer. LDCs require technologies to adapt to the impact of climate change, and also to go for clean production. So that discussion is also undertaking. I mean, in the TRIPS agreement, the issue of technology transfer has been highlighted. That discussion has to be concluded. The other discussion on the liberalization of environmental goods and services, that is also has been taking place for long, and that should be concluded. But in the discussion of the liberalization of environmental goods and services, we have seen that there are very few products of LDCs which are in the list, and these lists have to be, firstly, this list have to be expanded, and more products from the LDCs should be included in that. I would like to also, conclude by referring to what has been also mentioned by others, also the issue of fisheries subsidies. In many LDCs, fisheries is one of the important sources of protein, and many subsistence fishermen or fisher community, they rely for their livelihoods on this sector. However, harmful subsidies are detrimental not only to the environment, but also to the livelihoods of these small fishers. So the WTO members, they have adopted the Fisheries Subsidy Agreement, which is a positive move, and this is actually an agreement which is very useful for the sustainability of the fisheries sector, marine fisheries sector particularly. So this is a good initiative, and this has also very much relevance for the LDCs. I think I would stop here. We can discuss later on. But what I try to focus on that very briefly, though this is the part of a large paper, but I try to summarize some of the major issues in the context of LDCs, which are focused on climate change priorities of the LDCs, and also in the context of the trade measures. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Khatun. We were able to read your slides very well in the end, but never fear, we will circulate them with your permission to all of those who've participated, along with Anne's. And that in fact answers one of the questions that we've already had in the chat box, so I can tick that off. Yes, you will get the slides if you're registered to participate. We've had a number of interesting questions actually come through in the chat. So what I'd like to do is to allocate some of those questions to our speakers and leave them to think about those questions while I attempt to answer one that we've had come online, and then I'll welcome questions and comments from the floor. So maybe the first quick round of questions. And first maybe comes for you, in fact, Ambassador. There's a question in the chat that asks us to explain perhaps a little bit more what the impact of climate change can be on trade and trade opportunities. And I thought this was something that you might be able to speak to from Samoa's perspective, but also potentially from the impact that you've seen of climate change in the broader Pacific region. And we've had a question come in also online about how, in particular, I think sort of small island states can manage energy shortages that might be caused by sort of immediate natural disasters caused by climate change. And I suppose the question that I'd have is, how do you factor sort of energy and energy production into adaptation planning? Are there sort of frequent things that countries put in adaptation plans to manage the energy transition? And Joel, I'm going to come back with my question for you. What would a vulnerability index be used for in the context of the WTO? The floor, so those are the first three questions. If anyone in the room would like to offer a question or comment, you're very welcome to put your hand up and I'll call on you. While you think about what your question or comment might be, I'm going to have a go at answering myself a question that I see from my friend Christian Haberly. Hi, Christian. Thank you for joining us. So the question that Christian has put in the chat sort of asks us to be more specific about the kinds of climate smart agricultural practices that would actually require a change to WTO rules or to the Paris Agreement. I think I can speak on our behalf jointly here to say that in fact what we, at least as ISD, have been thinking about is not necessarily changes to multilateral trading rules. What we're particularly interested in is how countries can use their own domestic trade policy and shape it unilaterally to support their own adaptation priorities. Right? So there may be some things that they can do without necessarily needing to coordinate with other governments to do. So in our mind, the scope of trade policy starts at the unilateral level. There may be things that they decide they cannot do themselves unilaterally. They need to cooperate with others to create a broader market for disaster risk insurance, to give an example. And that might require either regional coordination in the scope of or in the shape of a trade policy decision or a cooperative trade policy agreement. And at the very top of the pyramid is the idea of changing multilateral trade rules to respond to adaptation. And that might certainly be on the cards, but I just wanted to make the point that in our mind, the trade policy question starts with very simply, what can governments do for themselves with respect to their own trade policy settings to move this ahead? So I hope that's answered your question a little bit, Christian, although I know there'll probably be a follow-up. Would anyone in the room like to ask an additional question before I put the floor back to the panelists? I don't see any hands up. So while you think, Ambassador, perhaps I'll give you the floor first, the impact of climate change on trade. And if there was anything that you left out of your intervention that you'd like to add in, feel free.
Thanks, Alice. The impact of climate change on trade and trade opportunities. Very, very simply, the more frequent occurrence of cyclones and natural disasters has a very severe impact on. In the early 1990s, I can already say that Samoa was hit by 2 cyclones back to back. And after that, it deterred people from investing in agriculture because it wiped out months and years of crops that have been planted. And just living in that context and in that setting, when opportunities arise, such as temporary and seasonal work abroad, people are tempted, are enticed to take up that because it doesn't the impacts of a cyclone. It's easy for them to pick up and go to Australia and New Zealand and work there and send the money home through remittances. The frequent occurrence of floodings changed our import patterns. We are net importing countries. The impact of frequent cyclones impacts food security. So therefore, the already negative trade, the imbalance is again impacted because we import more food when there's more cyclones. So what are we trying to do about that, to address that? Well, we're looking at planting seasonal. You know, in actual fact, 12 months out of the year, the 2 seasons, wet and dry season, half of the year is the cyclone season. So we need to ensure that we plant accordingly to take into account the wet and dry season, the rainy season, the cyclone season, we call it. And then, of course, as I've mentioned, through the Pacific Aid for Trade strategy, we're looking more at services and digital trade and use opportunities through technological advances. So those are, in my simple response to what is the impact on climate change on trade and some of the actions that have been taking place at home and in the region to try and address that. And I think I'm also interested in the response by my colleague Joel on SIDS, and especially SIDS at the WTO. But I just wanted to also leave that recent reviews of climate adaptations projects in Samoa have revealed the need for a programmed and strategic approach to the funding of adaptation options and measures, and not necessarily on a project-by-project approach. We believe that the successful adaptation of small island states will depend on supportive institutions, finance, information, and technological support. And as such, we stand with our partners to share our particular circumstances, to mold and influence the developments of international policies, and in this instance, international trade policies and climate change adaptation. Yes, at the multilateral level, sorry, I'm coming into the issue. I think in negotiating multilateral rules, there has to be a recognition of this specific circumstances of small island developing states, which we can have that conversation in a separate forum. Thank you very much, Alice.
No, thank you very much indeed, Ambassador. I think that was an extremely specific and very grounded response to that question. So I hope the person who asked it is satisfied. Given that you finished perhaps on the question of kind of specific recognition of small island states and their vulnerabilities, I might perhaps turn to you, Joel, next, if that's okay, to answer the question on the index. Go ahead. And anything else you'd like to add before we close?
Thank you, Alice. And sorry for not clarifying earlier, but the way we see the index, so there are all these conversations taking place in the WTO about special and differential treatment. We see the index as being part of that broader conversation. We see it as a tool that can be used to point developing countries, which are SIDS, in the direction of being able to access more carve-outs and flexibilities, but not just for the sake of carve-outs and flexibilities, but it's also about helping to make the special and differential treatment that they're able to access much more appropriate, much more effective, much stronger than it is even now. So it's in that context that we're looking at it. It's also about generally strengthening the development dividend that we can achieve in the WTO system. And of course, specific to technical assistance and capacity building, it's to ensure that it's much more targeted. So for instance, and the ambassador spoke eloquently to the practical ways in which climate change impacts also affect trade in a very direct way. So in instances where entire economic sectors are wiped out, in instances where we are not producing because there's been a disaster, then the kind of TSCB that we can access, perhaps it's a bit more specific. And of course, outside of the WTO, because one of the challenges we face is with respect to finance. And so if there's this index that says that these countries are vulnerable, but they're vulnerable on multiple fronts, and there's a consensus on what constitutes that extent of vulnerability, then we can make a case to say that the approach to financing adaptation in those countries would be different than it would be in other countries because their needs are specific. And you can make that determination on the basis of this index that you have said, and we have all agreed to, responds favorably to their conditions, their vulnerable conditions. So we're looking at the index in those conversations. And of course, there are academics in our region, such as at the University of the West Indies, who are also speaking of a trade vulnerability index. So even beyond the multidimensional vulnerability index, which our development bank is pushing, academics are also thinking of an index specific to trade. So it's really in that context.
Super. I knew you'd have a really good answer. So I wasn't worried about asking the question, but thank you. That's really helpful. And I think puts the idea in a really practical context for us here. Anne, I'm going to pass the floor to you next for this question about energy in the adaptation space.
Great, thanks for that. And it's a really great example of how adaptation and mitigation can come together. So in terms of managing energy shortages, I think the general approach, but I would yield to my colleagues who are more specialized in energy, but what we've observed is diversifying the energy mix, moving towards more decentralized renewable energy, like local solar and biomass production. So making sure that energy production is more closely located to where energy consumption takes place. And then I think, in not most, but maybe in a lot of the national adaptation plans that are being developed, the energy sector is called out as a sector that needs itself to adapt to the impacts of climate change. And so looking at a country's energy mix and understanding, if the energy infrastructure needs to be built differently, built out in different places as a result of changing climate risks. We worked on a project a while ago in Rwanda, which at the time was really reliant on hydropower for a lot of its energy. And of course, shifting rainfall patterns combined with, how wetlands and reservoirs are being managed have huge implications for the country's energy security. So looking at, the systems that not only underpin energy provision, but the infrastructure as well that provides energy and allows for the consumption of energy needs to be climate proofed. And then again, like I said, looking at strategies for diversification, so you're not overly reliant on one type of energy. And then again, looking at decentralization to build a bit more flexibility and strength into the system. These are sort of some ideas I have of how energy is brought into the mix. Thanks.
No, thank you. Again, very practical, grounded points. Dr. Khatun, you're not going to get away without a last question. And thank you for staying on with us. I was really interested in the discussion that you put about financing, also as ISD specifically calling out the role of fossil fuel subsidies in the financing and transition question, because I think that's an important one to come back to. Also about the adaptation that LDC production will have to make, in fact, to mitigation-driven climate trade measures like border carbon adjustments and sustainability standards. And I wanted to ask you a question, in fact, that's come up online, and it's the question about access to technologies, because you didn't touch on it, I don't think, terribly much on your presentation. And I wondered if you wanted to say just a couple of words, because we have only a few minutes, but specifically about your perspective about LDC's access to technology and what some of the main barriers might be. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Yes, the issue of technology transfer is extremely important for LDCs, and because both for adaptation and mitigation, technology, state-of-the-art technology is very important. And also in the context of trade, indeed, whether you are following the new rules and new policy measures which are to be followed by the LDCs, the importance of technology cannot be overemphasized. Indeed, the LDCs which are already in the pipeline of graduation, and also those there are again 15 LDCs which will be graduating in the coming decade or so. So they are terribly behind in terms of technology, technological index. There are various indexes, and some of these, if you look at access to digitalization from the basics of it, so the landscape is very, very narrowed towards the LDCs. So that's one issue. The other issue I also want to mention that when you graduate, the compliance would be very, very stringent. Now, the least developed countries get market access without paying duties, but once they graduate, there will be compliances, various types of compliances, not only labor compliances, but also environmental compliances. So for that, they have to green their industries, green their agriculture sector, green their all other sectors. So that is a huge undertaking they have to take. I would also like to, I think one of the questions were raised that how trade can also have an impact on the LDCs in terms of their livelihood. A specific example, the most recent example we can cite is that at this point in time, the food crisis is looming large. The Food and Agriculture Organization has projected that 45 countries are at risk of food crisis in the coming months and years. And this has been this has not only been due to the war in Ukraine, but also because of the climate impact, the changing climate events. And as a result, what we have seen during the food crisis, there are various protectionist measures. Countries have already resorted to protectionism either by banning export of commodities, for example, wheat, or by increasing the taxes or tariffs. So when these types of measures are taken, this is it is the LDCs or the poor countries, small island countries, all these countries which are low income, in the low income category, they are the victims of these. So this is again that the rules in the WTO bodies. This is very much relevant for this. This cuts across both climate and trade measures. So this is a very relevant example to my mind, where the international rule-setting bodies can have a responsibility.
No, thank you very much indeed. I think that's an extremely useful reminder, particularly for me, of the specific situation of graduating LDCs, right? Because it is in trade policy terms, it's a really significant shift that they're facing. We're out of time. I have to stop here, but thank you very much, all of you who've joined us online and all of you in the room. Thank you in particular to the speakers, Ambassador and Joel and Dr. Kahun. It's been fantastic to have you all here. I hope you have all found this an interesting and useful discussion. And it's a topic that we at ISD are very much committed to, because it's so existentially and deeply important to some of the most vulnerable developing countries, and because it's something that we've been working on for a while. So we look forward to continuing this conversation with you on the panel and with all of you in the room and those of you online. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to get in touch and enjoy the rest of this year's Trade and Environment Week. Thank you very much indeed.